Hi, this is Andrew, and this is Keen On, the daily chat show featuring the world's leading thinkers and writers. Hello, everybody. A couple of months ago, we did an interesting show with a journalist called Simon Schuster. He has a new book out, a biography of Vladimir Zelensky, the president leader of Ukraine. The book is called The Showman Inside the Invasion That Shook the World and Made a Leader of Vladimir Zelensky. Schuster is the Time magazine correspondent who traveled around very much with Zelensky, so he knows all about him. Schuster's an interesting character. He grew up in the 1990s, and according to a piece that I read in KQED, he couldn't imagine there'd be a war between Russia or Ukraine. He'd been in the middle of it. That KQED piece was written by my guest today, who in many ways is rather similar to Schuster. She also grew up in San Francisco in the 1990s. Sasha Vasiljuk is a distinguished journalist, all sorts of interesting pieces she's written about Ukraine. She has a first novel, Your Presence is Mandatory, which is a book that's already being acclaimed and is planned to be published in several translations. She's joining us from Northern California, where she's on holiday from a hotel room. Sasha, do you have much in common with Schuster in this sense that you're from many different places simultaneously?
Yes, not only that, me and Simon are actually really close friends. And we went to high school together in San Francisco, which is how I know him. And when he became a journalist in Moscow, I was there for a period of time. So he introduced me to Alexei Navalny and other foreign correspondents and people there. Anyway, so it's actually really interesting that we have books together, kind of at the same, coming out at the same time. And his book and his work is super important. I'm not stationed in Ukraine, but I was born in Ukraine and then moved to Moscow and then moved to San Francisco. So I spent half of my childhood in Ukraine and half of it in Russia. And that can get complicated because now there's obviously a war between the two. But I have family in both, or had family in both, until recently. All my relatives in Russia had fled and are now refugees, and half of my relatives in Ukraine also fled and are also refugees in various European countries. And then some, my aunt, who has been very helpful with my novel, she is still in Kiev.
You wrote a New York Times piece. You've written some excellent op-eds. This was back in 2022 after the original invasion. My family never asked to be liberated, but you also wrote a recent piece in the New York Times entitled, this was from last month in April 2024, How Do I Talk to My Son About a War I Don't Understand? Why don't you understand this war, Sasha?
Having grown up in both places and traveled freely between the two, speaking the same language, my family in Ukraine always spoke Russian to me. Um, it was, this conflict is unfathomable. Even the fact that it's in its 10th year somehow doesn't make it make any more sense, weirdly. So for most people in America, certainly, this conflict is about 2 years old, right? It started in 2020. For those in the know, and particularly for my family that I've written about, they lived in the Donbass, which became a war zone in 2014 and has remained that since. I traveled there in 2016 to visit them and saw a city that I like spent every summer in, turn into this unrecognizable bullet hole ridden place. And so while I I mean, obviously, right? I watch the news like everyone else. I understand the kind of the reasons that are given for this war. It doesn't really make sense. It never made sense for the people in Russia either, right? Or for Ukrainians. Everybody just kind of woke up to this war, and it continues to. I think it's reasons, and it's reasons for continuing. It's reasons for being so brutal. Continues to feel kind of like a bad dream that one day we'll all wake up from, and it will not have been true. Perhaps it's, I don't know, perhaps it makes sense more to outsiders than insiders in some weird way, but um, Russians and Ukrainians, in my mind, were always kind of not one people, but they were very similar and very brotherly, and many families have relatives on both sides, even today.
Yeah,
So,
you joked, I know at the beginning, it wasn't, you didn't mean it as a particularly funny joke, but you told your grandmother that this war will last forever. And as you say, it seems to be. Humor
yeah.
is obviously important, both in your worldview, in your work. But it's not a very funny war, is it?
Um, it is certainly not, and yet every time I talk to my aunt, I swear to you, every time, which is quite often, it's more, sometimes more than once a week, she cracks a joke every time, consistently.
Where's your aunt at the moment?
She's in Kiev. She used to be in the Donbass until very recently, and then, haha, she got cancer, which is the only way she was finally ready to leave her home where she was born, after 9 years of like hearing shelling basically daily, and dividing her days and nights between loud ones and quiet ones. That's like what her life sort of became. She got cancer, and there's not even like water in hospitals, in Donetsk, and so and certainly no medicine. So she finally was like, okay, I guess I'll leave, and now she's in Kiev getting treatment.
And I don't mean this in a accusatory way, but is your family Jewish?
I certainly don't take it in an accusatory way. My family's partly Jewish. I have a very complex and strange background, because none of my passports and I don't know, none of my languages or ethnicities sort of correspond to each other. But yes, my grandfather in Ukraine was Jewish, and he is kind of the main person behind
Right.
my
We're gonna
novel.
get to your novel in a second.
Yeah.
And again, the reason I asked, Zelensky is of course Jewish as well. Are the Jews of Ukraine slash Russia, or people sort of with one foot in each, one heart in each, are they different from the others in terms of how they approach this conflict, or do you think the Jews of Ukraine and Russia treat this war in identical ways?
I think the main distinguishing factor there would be whether or not they're there or here, right? There's like a huge diaspora of mostly Jewish people who left Ukraine or Russia or any of the other Soviet republics. And I think their attitude may be one way, but from what I see from the people who are still there, from the Jewish people who are still there, I don't really see a big difference. I think it's mostly, are you an immigrant or are you committed to living in your homeland and you see it as your homeland, no matter what your kind of religious or ethnic background is.
You wrote an interesting piece also in the Los Angeles Times recently, another op-ed talking about you lost a close friendship. I don't know if you chose these titles. Sometimes
You never do.
writers always like to separate themselves from the titles of their piece. But I lost a close friendship to Putin's war. It's not Russia's war, Putin's war in Ukraine. Some people might say, well, so what? Wars always divide people. You've written a lot about how pre-Russian invasion of Ukraine, pre-war, no one cared in the diaspora where you're from. Now everyone is much more sensitive. Does that really matter? Is everyone now, do they all have particularly sensitive antennae about where you're from, your identity, and of course your position on the war?
Very much so. I feel like every time. in the past, every time I would hear Russian, for instance, just like outside in America, my ears would perk up kind of naturally, right? It's my native language. And I would most often perceive them as somebody that I could talk to, that could be not necessarily that would become friends, but that there'd be some commonality there. And now I notice that every time I come across somebody speaking Russian, it's I'm a little bit on alert because I don't know where they stand, right? I don't know if they're like ardent Putin lovers, at which point I would have a hard time maybe talking to them, or they're kind of on my political viewpoint side. Um, this, I think, for Americans, there is maybe some similarity with like the politics of the last however many 8 years, 4 years, I guess, with Trump, right? Like the awkward family dinners that people have been talking about, where it's hard to touch politics because there's probably an uncle or a parent or whoever that's on the other side, and it's going to get ugly. Um, this is similar, except people are actually dying, and one side may feel either responsible for it or kind of the opposite. This feel, even though this isn't like civil war, because it is technically two different countries and two sort of different people, for people who grew up in at all in kind of the Soviet time space horizon, it feels like it. I remember reading about civil war in Russia, and America obviously had one too a long time ago. And it sort of it was always very hard to fathom, like how a brother would go against a brother or a neighbor against a neighbor. And now I guess now I know what that's like, and that you are always on alert, even for people with whom you would normally associate.
Yeah, it's
Just
interesting. Have you seen the new Civil War movie out in the US? A lot of sensitivity about that. So we're all on the brink of it. As I noted earlier, you say you weren't you wrote a Times piece suggesting that you didn't quite know what you would tell your son about. I know you got a 3 and a 6 year old, so fortunately they're not old enough now, I guess, to really get the talk on the war. But you didn't really know what to tell your son about a war you don't understand. But then you said when you meet people, you don't know where they stand. Do you know where you stand? I mean, is this ultimately Putin's war, an authoritarian war to somehow reposition himself in Russia and in the world? How would you explain it? Where do you stand?
I yes, I do prefer calling it Putin's war when I write, versus Russia's war, because I know too many people in Russia or people who fled Russia recently who are very much against it, and I do think that's important to keep in mind, even though for a lot of Ukrainians, it's all in the same. There's no good Russians. It's sort of a common phrase over there. But and I understand that sentiment. But yes, to me, given how surprising this war was to people in Russia when they woke up to it, right? It is very much. It feels very much like his initiative. And when I talk to my aunt, she feels the same way. I don't think she certainly doesn't blame like every citizen of Russian Federation for it. And everybody, even though it's sort of maybe silly, but everybody keeps hoping that if he disappears in some way, that it would end. That it's like really matters to him more than to anyone else. And even if his close circle now kind of subscribes to it, and eggs him on, maybe in many ways, it just it's his initiative, and I don't know, unless we deal with what he wants, kind of as the West, we being the West, I don't know that this will end. I don't know that giving arms to Ukraine will solve everything, right? It's militarily, it's not, things aren't great. Size wise, it's an obvious, Russia has an obvious advantage. I also feel like, because I've been studying World War II a lot, and kind of it's occurring to me lately how how this war drags on, and sort of it feels very purposeful. It feels like Russia, and I'm not a military expert, so take this with a grain of salt, but like Hitler really threw everything he had, right? He was very much eager to gain land and take it and get the people, like get everything. And Putin didn't throw everything. And I feel like it's partly because he's very concerned about his popularity, and he wants the people that he governs in Russia to be more or less comfortable, right? He doesn't really want to disturb them. He's not throwing like all of, people rise up and go conquer Ukraine, right? He's kind of playing both sides, which means that he's like half doing this war in a way, and it's just kind of a blood-sucking way of doing it, of dragging it on for 10 years, just slowly seeping Ukraine of its strength, of its enthusiasm, of its resolve. And right, it's hard to be super enthusiastic about a war after 2 years, after you see so many people die around you. So yes, I think it's Putin's war, and somehow somebody, I hope, deals with it in some way and gets rid of
We
him.
had an Italian journalist who wrote an interesting piece for Harper's a few months ago, who traveled through Russia. I'm not sure if he went to the Ukraine, but he reported back that the Western media on Russia is very Moscow, St. Petersburg centric, and he talked to lots of people who seem to like Putin. And he noted also the resurrection of the cult of Stalin. I know you wrote an interesting piece for CNN, another rather bleak piece suggesting that after Navalny's death, you mentioned him at the beginning, that Schuster had introduced him to you to his circle, that after his death a few weeks ago, that extinguished the last hope you had for your former former home. Tell me briefly, and then we've got to take a break, about the death of Navalny and why you've given up any hope of reforming Russia. From your point of view, reform.
Yeah, so Navalny was a symbol, right? He was already in jail when he died, so it's not like there was a practical hope that yes, this man will take things over. No, but he was a symbol, and an important one, that somebody was willing to actually stand up to Putin in a time where a lot of people expected Russian people to rise up when this war began, and when they didn't, it kind of changed a lot of people's attitude toward Russians, and they started to believe that Russians may be for this war as well. And he was this kind of ray of hope that no, the Russians do, some Russians, at least this one man, if nothing else, if no one else, has the power and has the strength and the courage to rise up to him. Without him, there is no visible courage. There is actually a small Russian opposition, even within Russia today, that operates. I heard a wonderful podcast about that recently. That's very underground. So it's nice to hear that somebody, is doing something, and among my friends as well there. But he was a visible sign of courage for kind of the world, and without him, there's no one else representing that side of things.
We're speaking with Sasha Vasiljuk, the author of a wonderful new novel, Your Presence is Mandatory, her first novel. We haven't barely even talked about it, Sasha. We're going to take a break and then talk specifically in the second half of the show about your new book. I want to remind everyone that wonderful guests like Sasha are brought to us because of our friends at Liberties, an excellent new quarterly of culture and politics. Going to run a short feature on Liberties. And then we'll be back with Sasha Vasiljuk to talk about her excellent new novel, Your Presence is Mandatory. Your presence, of course, is mandatory in this second half. So don't go away. We're watching you.
The noise, there is nuance, insight. Liberties is not just a journal of ideas. It's a meteor of intelligent substance. It's the place to be for engaged citizens. Politics, opinion, substance. Liberties is a triumph for freedom of thought. A quarterly of urgency, of cultural exploration, of intellectual delight, of immaculate prose. It's invaluable. Subscribe now or find Liberties at your favorite bookseller.
And you can subscribe to Liberties at libertiesjournal.com. Strongly encouraged. We're talking with Sasha Vasiljuk, the San Francisco-based author of Your Presence is Mandatory. In the first half of the show, Sasha, you mentioned the Second World War. Of course, we've done many, many shows. One with the great British historian Richard Overy, who asked whether in his last book, has the Second World War ended yet? He concluded it hadn't. We're still living in some ways in the consequences of the Second World War, which is certainly the case in the Ukrainian war. We did another interview with an American writer, novelist, Kristen Beck, who suggested that World War II remains very seductive for novelists because it enables them to write about pure good and evil. But my sense of your new novel, Your Presence is Mandatory, Sasha, is twofold. Firstly, the book suggests that perhaps the Second World War hasn't ended yet, like the current war in Ukraine, and in terms of your joke to your grandmother, perhaps it will never end. But it's also a book which suggests that the war is much more complicated than one purely between evil Nazis and good Russians and Americans. Is that fair?
Yes, it is. Yes, I did not want to write a typical novel of World War II where every German person is basically an evil Nazi. And every, person on the Ally side, in my case, a Soviet person is, good. And that comes from research. It comes from reading firsthand accounts of people who were there, who saw how much more complex it is. And obviously, right, we now live in a war, and I see how it plays out. I see that not every Ukrainian is good and not every Russian is bad, right? Just to keep the same analogy. I don't know, that's a very dumb way of thinking about the world and humanity, right? It's much more complex than that. But I guess your other guest is right that World War II does have these kind of very heated up and very polarizing black and white sort of feelings. It isn't why I wrote about it. I wrote about World War II because my grandfather, who was a veteran of World War II, never talked about it. And then when he died, my grandmother found a confession letter that he'd written to the KGB in the 80s, where he revealed what really happened to him during World War II. And it was very different from what we assumed. So we kind of perceived him as a war hero. And what he turned out to be that he was captured very early in the war by the Germans. And being a Soviet POW was already a pretty bad place to be in Germany. They treated POWs with, it wasn't as bad as the Holocaust, I suppose, as Jews, but it was close. They killed 3.2 million of Soviet POWs, very much purposefully. And it's one of the least kind of studied subjects of World War II and areas of World War II. But he had the additional complication of also being Jewish. So, right, if he was found out, that would be the end of him. And when I read accounts of other Jewish POWs, who survived to talk about it afterward, they would often describe how they were able to get away with it. And sometimes it would be a German who'd overlook something. So it's a guard that would look the other way, or it's a doctor that would, inspect their naked body, see that they were circumcised, for instance, and then just kind of not say something. I'm not saying that was primarily like the main way they escaped, but it happened, and it was very surprising when I saw that. It told me that I'm like, okay, not every German was an evil Nazi. It also, the other surprising fact I found out was how often Jewish POWs and other people who were kind of given up to the Nazis were given up by their own comrades. What that told me was sort of very actually similar to what we're seeing today, is that I was always taught, as somebody who grew up in the Soviet Union, like this idea of brotherhood, how we're all, we're all one people, we speak the same language, we have the same values, and, we love the same movies. And in the 40s, Soviet Union was somewhat of a new country, right? It was only 20-year-old, barely 20 years old. And people were brought together from very different, disparate places. Like, I don't know, Uzbekistan and Lithuania are not at all similar, right? These people had literally nothing in common. All of a sudden, they're governed by the same person, and are forced to speak the same language, and give up their religion and their traditions. And then they're thrown into a war with a common enemy. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they are best friends, right? Like, they don't really care for a person from Uzbekistan or a person from Lithuania. Completely false. And now we're seeing kind of today's result of the same thing, that we're not actually friends. We're not actually willing to stand up for each other often in this Eastern European kind of melting pot. So yes, the novel has a lot of nuance. It is getting published in Germany, and I think it is because because I there's nuance to the people. There's a range.
Right, but it doesn't offer a free pass to the Germans, does it? I mean,
It does not. There's plenty of bad Nazis in there, as there were in real life. But there's also people who live. I have a character who's a girl in Germany whose dad was a communist, so he was arrested. Right, and she's living with this kind of mark on her life. And then there's a Belarusian character. Mine is supposed to kind of help save our main character. Euphemia is loosely based on my grandfather, and instead gives him up. And that was a real fact that I learned from my grandfather's letter, that it was a Belarusian forced laborer who he came across when he was running away from captivity. And it was a Belarusian, right, who normally would be another Soviet citizen. So you'd think he'd save him, but instead he gave him up to the police, to the German police. So I really wanted to make sure that I add all these complex layers.
Layers on layers on layers, like those Russian dolls, Sasha. Americans like to have clean breaks and beginnings and ends, but of course the Second World War wasn't the beginning. There was much history before the Second World War, particularly in Ukraine. We've had Anne Applebaum on the show, who wrote the award-winning book on Soviet policy in Ukraine and the famine. How did your family experience the 30s in the Ukraine, in Donbass?
Yeah, so both of my grandparents, my Jewish grandfather and my Ukrainian grandma, they were both kids when during the famine, which is 32, 33 primarily. My grandfather lived in a village and my grandmother lived in the city, and there was a big difference between the two. So a lot of villagers would, because all of their food and grain was taken away, they would often try to sneak into the cities to try to get food. My grandmother wrote a memoir, which was very helpful in me researching the book, but she described, she remembers, because she wasn't like a small child, she was like 8 or 9, something like that. So she remembers how her dad would tell her not to go to where kind of the garbage bins were kept on the street, because that's where the dead bodies would be. And I think it took her.
And these are the people who died of starvation.
These are people who died of starvation, but not
and
only
many
that,
millions. I mean, the numbers are astonishing. Applebaum's numbers, it's in the millions.
Yes, it's definitely in the millions. I feel like every tragedy that happens in that part of the world, it's always always numbers in the millions. Yeah, what was interesting about my grandmother's experience is that I think as a child, she felt like, okay, there's kind of a natural starvation. She didn't blame her government for it. That came much later in her life, in the 90s, when she was kind of learning the history of Ukraine, and seeing and realizing that those bodies of villagers who snuck in, they snuck in because they were being prevented from it. There was police who was trying to prevent people from eating, like, and just that concept really, it really changes your understanding of your own homeland, and of the government under which you lived, right?
Sasha, in terms of the anger, the finger pointing after the Soviet policy in Ukraine when it comes to the famine, when people were angry, were they angry at communists or Russians? Was there a notion of Russianness and Ukrainianness in your view in the 1930s?
Whoa, it's a yeah, that's a hard question because I'm not a historian.
But you've talked to, I
I
mean, this is a very
yes, I
personal story. You've
so
talked to your relatives, your grandparents.
yeah, I didn't really see that in the way my grandmother described it. And to me, she's kind of, she's like the main witness to it. But of course, she was a child. I will tell you that in her city where she lived, she described it as very much like a melting pot. You could hear four different languages on the same block. And So, there was lots of Jews, there was Ukrainians, there was Russians, there was Germans. Like, it was very kind of mixed, just a world very hard to actually imagine right now. And so she didn't see it that way. It wasn't like, oh, the Russians came in and ordered us to do things. But this is somebody who was born what in the Soviet Union already. Like, she's born the same kind of year that it was formed. I think for people who lived in the pre-Soviet times, so like her parents, that view would have been different. And I think that's kind of how history goes, right? Like, each generation has their own reality, and I think that's why there's always like kind of generational rifts, even with like politics, especially, or in America as well with Trump. It is often a generational divide, because people lived with a certain reality that they knew, that maybe they miss, that they're nostalgic about in their youth. And all of a sudden that reality is no longer true. So they're holding on to it, versus a new generation, right? Where they never had whatever it is that the other generation's nostalgic for. So yeah, so in that example, somebody who lived under like the Tsar may or may not, given depending on their conditions, right? Like, I don't think the Jews of Ukraine particularly missed the Tsar. Communism was at first a good thing for them, because they could
And there
move
were
out of,
many,
yeah,
many
they had
very
opportunity.
powerful Jews. You talked about generations. As a writer, you're bringing generations back to life. This book is multi-layered and multifaceted, and exists on lots of time fronts. I saw the Amy Winehouse biopic last night, which probably isn't comparable to your book. But it does speak of Amy Winehouse's very close relationship with her grandmother, and the way in which her relationship with her grandmother really informed her music and her experience, which of course she's left to the world. Is your book, this book, which is in many ways a book, even if it's a novel, it is deeply autobiographical. Is it your way of keeping the past alive, of maintaining a relationship with your grandparents, your aunt, many generations who have lived before you?
It is, but I also feel like it's more than that. So a lot of stories in the Soviet Union were silenced. There was such a prevalence of the state version of events, state version of history, and there was so much fear and shame on an individual level that a lot of people, my grandfather being an example, kept what happened to them quiet, either their whole life or until their deathbed. And this is super common. At first, I thought, when I kind of discovered that KGB letter that I mentioned, I thought this is just like my grandpa's, this unique individual. And the more I talk to, and it's actually interesting now that the book has been out for a month, I keep people keep coming up to me and telling me stories of their grandparents and how things that their grandparents didn't talk about until the very, very end. Um, and how whatever they told them usually was very eye-opening and shocking. And so what that tells me is that this book is sort of taps into a kind of a personal history that opposed what the state history taught us, but was silenced for that reason. And I feel like now it's a novel, but it sort of acquired this mission given that there's now an actual war and World War II is being used by Putin as one of his weapons, and kind of his version of history, and this resurging cult of Stalin. All of that tells me that people don't really know their history. They very much know what they've been told by the state, and because their grandparents basically didn't tell them the reality, much more complex reality of how their Soviet state and Stalin treated them, they are blind to it, and they can now easily believe into like whatever Putin feeds them. And so it's important. So these stories they're not just a connection, they're actually a super important way of understanding our history that's been so hidden away from us.
There you have it. Talk to your grandparents if you want to keep the past alive. Finally, Sasha, you've been very generous with your time. The book is out. Your presence is mandatory. It got a very nice review in Publishers Weekly by Bethan Patrick, an old friend of the show who does a monthly feature on Keenon. I don't want you to give away everything about the book because obviously we want people to buy it. But perhaps we might end with just your summary of. It's a hard book to describe, but you'll do a better job because it's your book. What is this book about, and why should people read it?
It's a book about a war prisoner, or sorry, a war veteran who is forced to hide what happened to him for the rest of his life, and how that silence and that secrecy at the center of a family affects everybody around him. So that's kind of on the literal level, but on the more meta level, I suppose, it is an important way of remembering history in all its nuance in the face of two totalitarian regimes who very much had their own agenda, and are now, or one of them at least, is now resurfacing, and weaponizing and actually killing real people in today's Ukraine. So yeah, I want people obviously to read it because it seems to be very eye-opening on the history. It helps people understand how we got to where we got to today, in a way, but in a way that's relatable